Hello, welcome to Blogging Heads, available via podcast, YouTube, also just bloggingheads.tv, so you can watch us as well as listen to us. I'm Bill Black. I'm a visiting professor of history at Western Kentucky University, and today I'm talking to Varsha Venkatasubramanian, a history PhD student at UC Berkeley. I guess we mainly just know each other through Twitter. In part because I have a project that I'll talk about in a little bit. I think it's how we really got to know each other. But we're going to mainly talk about the South Asian diaspora in the U.S. and the politics therein, the Democratic primary. We're going to talk about Modi and just the state of Indian politics and the kind of big picture of that stuff that I think a lot of people started pretending they knew anything about when Tulsi Gabbard became a thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. We had 2014 is billed as the biggest election in maybe even human history if you're looking at actual numbers of people who voted in India, but people didn't really actually care about Modi or Indian politics on a large scale until not just Tulsi Gabbard came on the forefront, but like when Modi started making these trips in the United States, right? Mm-hmm. So I find that really interesting that like it took a couple of years. There's a lagging time there.
Well, how would you sum up what the kind of, fairly intellectual lefty type, what their perception of Indian politics is?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the fairly intellectual lefty type, which sort of encompasses a lot of people on the Berkeley campus, they sort of view Modi as like a really simple and reductive way to put it is Donald Trump with job experience. Okay. Donald Trump with experience being what is the American equivalent of a governor of a state, but doing some pretty frustrating things as governor of that state. And I feel like that's to the extent of what most intellectuals know about Indian politics is that when Narendra Modi, the prime minister, was chief minister of Gujarat, he was accused of not doing enough to prevent large-scale riots and massacres of Muslims in 2002, right? And that's, I think, a lot of what a lot of people know about Indian politics right now, if they don't pay attention, is that there has been a history of communal violence, communal meaning Hindu-Muslim conflicts between Hindus and Sikhs, conflicts between other religious minorities. And that really is the forefront of what people are talking about today when they're looking at Indian politics, because the election is going to happen in the next couple of months, right? It's going to break down because 900 million people or 800 million people or so have to vote. It takes a couple of weeks for this voting process to go around the whole set of states. And so now people are starting to pay attention.
When's the upcoming election?
It begins around in a couple of weeks and it goes until May, I think mid-May. Yeah. And so, first, like there's like a series of stages where a bunch of states will vote. And I don't know the exact order because it's pretty complicated and there's like 27 states in India, but they do it over that because they want to get as many people as possible to vote. I think a huge majority of Indians vote in elections.
It's a pretty high turnout rate.
Really high turnout rate, yeah. They also have electronic ballots, which you can have issues with when it comes to security in the United States, as we have probably seen in the past couple of years. But that's what they have in India, and it's helped them really probably increase turnout even more, I would say.
Well, I am not going to pretend like I know much at all about Indian politics. Mm-hmm. It's a parliamentary system, right?
It is a parliamentary system. It is basically...
And this is like a 5-year general election type deal like they have in Britain? Is that basically?
Exactly. Yeah. It's basically it. So Modi was elected in 2014. He was elected from one of the first times since Rajiv Gandhi's election in 1984 with an actual governing majority, in the sense that like the BJP, the party that he belongs to, gained more seats than Congress, more seats than any other party, and therefore they were able to govern without a coalition, basically. And that hasn't happened since the 1980s, since Rajiv Gandhi's premiership.
What was his last? Here's one thing, one confession. I did not realize until maybe a few weeks ago that Indira Gandhi was not related to Mahatma Gandhi.
Yeah. So
and that she was Nehru's
she's Nehru's daughter. Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi is somebody that all Americans probably know. He is one of the major leaders of India's independence movement. He is totally separate from the family of Jawaharlal Nehru, who was our first prime minister. Mm-hmm. Nehru's daughter is Indira Gandhi, our first female prime minister. Her son is Rajiv Gandhi, and Rajiv Gandhi's son is Rahul Gandhi, and his daughter is Priyanka Gandhi. And Priyanka and Rahul Gandhi are currently basically at the forefront of Congress politics. Congress is the major governing, used to be the major party in Indian politics for decades, basically.
The Congress Party?
The Congress Party, yeah. They basically are the central figures in the creation of India's government and the creation of India's constitution, and for decades they were the major party. But what the 1990s and also the most recent election has shown us is that the BJP and other parties do have a role to play in this, right?
And I guess is it? I get the sense that it's not an easy, like, oh, the Congress Party is the left-wing party and the BJP is the right-wing party.
It's not.
Americans like to map everything on neatly onto.
We really do, yeah. And it is fair to say that the Congress Party can be considered on most political spectrums, especially the U.S. political spectrum, as like left of center. But it really is more close to center than left, mm-hmm. right? But the BJP can definitely be considered right-wing. I don't think they would deny that. Right-wing, not just on an American mapping system in terms of conservative economic policy, like really being business-oriented and really being focused on business development, but also pretty right-wing in their social conservatism, right? Because the BJP is rooted in Hindu nationalism, or at least this idea of really bringing together the Hindu majority of the Indian state.
All right. And I guess that's something that sounds the spookiest to people who don't know much about it. And it seems to be that's where the Tulsi Gabbard thing comes in. I fear that she's a Hindu nationalist. We don't have to talk about her a whole lot. I'm just she's often, where people start acting on Twitter like they didn't just read about this on Wikipedia, today. And
So basically, I mean, a quick, really, really quick history lesson, right? So the Bharatiya Janata Party is, I butcher the pronunciation, was formed in 1980.
That's the BJP?
Yeah, the BJP, okay. Modi's party, formed around 1980. And its antecedent is the Rashtriya, its antecedent is the RSS, basically, which is like a militant right-wing group. So the RSS, which, the correct way to say it is the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. It's formed around the early 20th century. It's formed as, basically in 1925 as a way to really bring together culture consciousness among Hindus. Right. Okay. And it is basically a paramilitary group, right? It has cult-like aspects. It's pretty violent. It has a role to play in a lot of communal violence in Indian history. But the BJP comes out from there. Okay. And
kind of like how what's the party in Ireland that basically came out of the IRA?
Yeah, basically. I actually don't know. I know what you're talking about, but I'm blanking on the name right now.
Sinn Féin.
Yeah, Sinn Féin. Exactly. Anyway. Yeah. And it's not like a perfect analogy, but that's basically what's scary about Hindu nationalism is that there is a really long history of this, right? And so the RSS was formed in the 1920s during this rising independence movement and frustration with the British Empire, mainly because, and the argument they make, people in the RSS and these intellectuals, is that the British Empire, as well as Muslim rule before this, Mughal rule, has frustrated the Hindu majority and the Hindu people and has ruined our stability in this country, right? Or in this desh. Desh is the Hindi word for land or homeland. Okay. And so Hindu nationalists, they basically believe that the fundamental nature of India's political identity is its Hinduness, it's Hinduism, and it's like Hinduism should replace secularism as the guiding principle of Indian society. And so if you want to look at this as like a big like Manichaean struggle, and it really isn't like that, but if you want to look at it like that, the origins of this conflict really root in the fact that the Congress Party, Jawaharlal Nehru, when the country is formed, really believe and stick with this idea of secularism. And the RSS and then eventually the BJP view Nehru and the Congress Party as basically accepting this corrupting influence of Western ideas and this aspect of secularism as destructive towards Indian society. And so that's.
And they opposed secularism as a sort of a project of empire. So like Hindu nationalism as a decolonizing project from their point of view. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's like a way to put it, because Hindu reform movements or Hindu fundamentalist movements in the 19th century and the early 20th century are really rooted in like pushbacks against British reforms, right? So looking at late 19th century British reforms of like age of consent, sati, etc., like all these reforms.
Sati, that's the thing where it was like a widow had to throw herself on a pyre. I'm this is like undergrad. So I'm
exactly, right. And so when you learn about this in college, or even high school, when you're learning about the British Empire, there's like periods of various reform in the British Empire, and one aspect of this reform is really looking at Hindu practices that they view as illiberal and not modern, right? And so sati is one of them. Sati is one of many. Age of consent is another. So these reforms are enacted, and Hindu fundamentalists, or a lot of Hindu intellectuals, basically view this as like a threat to their society. And they create this idea that for the past however many years, the Mughals first and then the British were able to control us because they're able to divide us in this way. And they're able to manipulate our religion and use our religion in order to enable these outside powers, such as the Mughals and the British, to rule India. And that's what frustrates and motivates the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS, to promote like this really like assertive and like traditional view of Hinduism.
And so and partly why I wanted you on is you've had these just very interesting, epic Twitter threads recently about what it's like dating in the Bay Area, and encountering many Hindu nationalists. I wonder, when you talk to someone who's a Hindu fundamentalist, Hindu nationalist, do they often? Because they would see you as a liberal, and do they often see that as basically like liberalism is in British Empire apologetics, or like, selling out to the West, or do they ever phrase it that way?
And so, like, sadly, I'm not an anthropologist and I haven't done the study, but I really do want to do this because I think it's a really fascinating way to understand the Indian diaspora, especially the young Indian diaspora, people who are like the Indian way to describe them is NRI, non-resident Indians. So people who are born in India, or people have a really like strong connection to the country. Either they were born there or born and raised there. And when they move to the United States, specifically, let's say the Bay Area, and start working in the tech industry, and then they experienced 2014. Either they were in India for the Modi's election, or they supported him from the United States or watched him get elected from the US. There's like two brands of this type of person. Again, this is all anecdotal, and it's just for my own entertainment sometimes. And I like to figure out which type of person this is, usually, which is sort of the lesser evil, let's say, or the lesser frustrating thing, is that it's usually a person who will say, I know Modi has some frustrating ties to the RSS, because Modi, the prime minister, does have ties to the RSS, right? Or I know that Modi has some frustrating rhetoric about Muslims, or frustrating rhetoric about the press and his political opponents, and he's done some things that may seem dangerous, but he ran on an economic populist message to really bring India to like the forefront of geopolitics, not just in terms of conflict with Pakistan, but also economic prominence, right? And that's what they see, that's what they view. And so that's how they will defend him. They're like, yeah, but his economic policy is good. And so like a really simplistic comparison is if you meet a Republican who like turns their nose up at Donald Trump's conservatism, like social conservatism and his immigration policy, but they'll be like, yeah, but the tax cuts were good. Right. And so that's like a simple way to look at it. That's like one type of person that I have encountered in the dating scene. And it's pretty frustrating. But you can encounter the other type of person. And surprisingly, they do exist. They're like few and far between, where they really do believe in the social conservatism and like Hindu nationalism of the general BJP party. Like, let's give Modi sort of like a benefit of the doubt and just be like, oh, he's just trying to benefit the economy. But recently I had an experience where he was like, Modi is the person who is like uniting India, uniting 80% of India, which is Hindu. And he was basically like defending this idea that even though India is a secular state, Prime Minister Modi is allowed to have his own personal views, and that can inform his politics, right? And that's few and far between, but it does exist. And I think like the reason it exists is that it's rooted in this like dual way of thinking of not only are there potential economic benefits, but there's also this idea that for 70 odd years, Congress has been, or the Indian government has not only been corrupt or frustrating to certain minorities, but the Congress party divides and conquers. That's how they win elections. And that's sort of like what they view other political parties as like really focusing on certain caste coalitions or religious coalitions. And people who are maybe Hindu nationalists or come from the Hindu right sort of say, hey, but the BJP is uniting the whole country, not just on an economic message, but also a cultural message. And so there are huge majorities of Hindus, non-observant and observant in the U.S. who support Modi.
I'm now going to commit what I was earlier mocking, but it does sound like that criticism of the Congress Party reminds me of the criticism of the Democratic Party as like, oh, they just do identity politics. They're just, they have this message for this, marginalized group and this message for that one, and they don't talk to the quote unquote real Americans or the majority of Americans.
So funny story, and I apologize if Rahul Gandhi is watching this or listening to this podcast, but a few years ago, and this is before the elections had ramped up, he came to Berkeley to give this big speech. And he gives this speech, and I go and see it. It's like literally right down the street from where I live. I go and see it with a couple of friends of mine who are also desi or Indian. And after the speech, I'm like, I call my mom just to tell her, hey, like I finally met an Indian politician. It was interesting. I didn't really learn a lot about what Rahul Gandhi actually believes from the speech, but that may be just because, I don't know, he had a bad speechwriter. Yeah, the audience, he had a bad speechwriter. But I remember telling her about it and how I was sort of like disappointed in the sense that I didn't really understand what his plan was to combat not just Hindu nationalism, but also the real frustrations that Indian people have when it comes to income inequality, when it comes to climate change, etc. I was a little like disappointed. And my mother is someone, we moved to the United States in 1998. She's someone who like barely follows US politics and barely follows Indian politics. Like she knows the general contours of everything. And the first thing she said was, yeah, this is just like the Democratic Party in the United States. And I was like offended at the comparison, but it is sort of true that for some people, and this is like not 100% accurate for every single Democrat or every single Republican or independent, and same thing when it comes to India, it's not true for everyone, but when you look at the Congress Party in India, there is a degree of truth that they have become complacent. That's just the facts, right? And there are huge scandals that have swept up Congress Party officials in the past couple of years. So it is true that the Congress Party, and I hate saying this phrase, is quote unquote out of touch.
Well, I mean, right? Just when I think that their really prominent national politicians are all descendants of like y'all's George Washington or whatever, or India's George, like that does sound sort of like really trying to milk that as dry as possible.
Yeah, and it's not as if there aren't hundreds of other Congress politicians or other parties in like regional states that like have prominence, and it's not as if like regional state parties aren't doing the work or whatever. But that is like a really important point. And Rahul Gandhi was actually asked this question at this talk that I went to a couple of years ago, where he was asked, "Is dynastic politics bad for India?" And by dynastic politics, what we mean is Rahul Gandhi's father was prime minister, his grandmother was prime minister, and his grandfather was prime minister. And yes, there were prime ministers in between, but he comes from a long line of prime ministers. And his answer was a little frustrating. Like, he gave an answer comparing himself and his father to like Abhishek and Amitabh Bachchan, who are two Bollywood stars. It's like, it would be like, George P. Bush and George W. Bush comparing themselves to two Hollywood stars, father and son duo or whatever, right?
Will Smith, Drew Barrymore and Lionel Barrymore,
exactly, or like Will Smith and Jaden Smith.
Sure.
They're like, and so like, because Will Smith and Jaden Smith are both in media and in entertainment, therefore it's okay that we have a huge, really powerful party huge, really powerful family like the Bushes, where two of them have been presidents. And I don't want this to turn into like a defense or not defense of dynastic politics, but that was sort of a cop-out answer that Gandhi gave, right? And that's because he can't avoid the fact that the Congress Party, regardless of what you think of them, has dominated Indian politics for like 60 odd years until 2014.
So was 2014 the first year that the BJP got, like, I know it was the first time they'd formed a majority, but had they ever like been able to cobble together a coalition before?
Yeah, in the 1990s. So it's not the first time that they were able to govern. This is just the largest victory for the BJP ever.
And what's it looking like for? What's the polling look like? Does it look like the BJP will keep their majority?
Yeah, so it's wildly confusing, especially for me as someone who's like only really started following Indian politics since I would say like 2012. Like, I knew everything about it before that, but like only since 2012 have I really been paying attention to what's been going on. And so I'm trying to decode it. And so like basically before this, there were a few state elections in certain states where Congress was able to make some gains. But since this hullabaloo over this attack in Kashmir and this hullabaloo over India, Pakistan, and whether or not they're going to go to nuclear war, there has been sort of like a bump for Modi, right? And so I think it's up in the air, and it really does depend on how Congress is able to mobilize its voters in some key states like Uttar Pradesh and other states. And it is sort of a toss-up. I don't think like we can actually project 100% either way. But it's not like, I don't know if there's an Indian Nate Silver, but I feel like even if there were an Indian Nate Silver, it would be difficult to give an actual probability on this, because it really does. It's really sort of hard to discern. But like, if I had to be pessimistic, I would say that Modi would win again.
Well, all right, here's a question. Well, first of all, you used the word desi earlier. D-E-S-I. Daisy?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Desi basically comes from the Sanskrit word desh. Desh means homeland.
Okay.
And so desi, usually I think it depends on who you talk to, but like for me, it's just desi is anyone from South Asian descent who lives abroad. So if I'm a desi, all my South Asian friends are desi. And I don't think, it's not really a term, like it's not, people don't really use it in India. They don't, like, that's not what they're talking about. In India, they'll just say Indian, right? So it really is a term for people who are in the diaspora.
Okay. And would there be anyone who is an Indian American who wouldn't be desi? Or
no, I think even if
you're like fourth generation.
Yeah. So there's other terms that are not as nice is not the word, because they're poking fun at it, but there's ABCD, American Born Confused Desi, which literally means you're born in the United States, but you've maybe visited India a couple of times, right? There's NRI, which is non-resident Indian. And so like, for example, how like other people, like British people or people from Europe, when they move to the United States, they can call expats. Like It's basically like that. And it's like, it's an interesting, I think it's an interesting identifier, the term desi itself, because it refers not just to people who are Indian, people who are from South Asia in general, right? They're all desi folks. So yeah, it's interesting that like desi, which comes from the word for homeland, literally refers to all aspects of South Asian in general.
So like Pakistani Americans use the word?
Yeah, so Pakistani Americans use the word, Bangladeshi Americans use the word, and it's not as if like every Pakistani American and Bangla American or Indian American is going to get along in the United States, but they would all use the word. Yeah.
A Hindi word. That's it.
Yeah. It's. I think it comes from like the Sanskrit original, but yeah, it's basically a Hindi word.
What it seems like the history of the partition of 1947, which my little snapshot is that basically with India gaining independence from the British Empire, sort of simultaneous with that was breaking it up into a majority Hindu state of India and a majority Muslim state of Pakistan, which used to include what's now Bangladesh, and they separated in the early 1990s or something like that.
Yeah, sorry, Bangladesh separated in the 1971 war.
Okay, all right.
With Pakistan.
Yeah,
so partition definitely is, I think, like, even if you're not a historian of partition, even if you're just a historian of like India, or if you're a historian of the empire, partition is central to understanding Indian, Pakistani, as well as Bangladeshi identity, right? It's also central to understanding the politics of like state building for India and Pakistan. If you just take 1947 as an example, right? And so what's difficult about it is there's like, as soon as it happens, immediately you have nationalist histories coming out, Pakistani nationalist and Hindu nationalist histories. Yeah.
What did you grow up sort of being told? What was sort of the consensus story that you were told?
Yeah. So I was told like an interesting story that basically it was everyone's fault. And by everyone's fault, I wasn't just told, oh, it was the fault of the British for leaving so quickly and totally destroying the country and basically being cowards. I was also told that it was Nehru's and Gandhi's cowardice, as well as Jinnah's cowardice as well. So
Who's the last one?
Jinnah, the first prime minister of Pakistan.
Oh, I thought Nehru was the first prime minister. I don't know where. Oh, the first prime minister of Pakistan.
Of Pakistan, yeah. So Jinnah is like the negotiator on behalf of basically what becomes Pakistan, right?
How do you spell his last name? I think I've seen
Jinnah.
Muhammad Ali Jinnah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Was that sort of kind of weird that you were told that story? Was that kind of unique to your family?
This is what's difficult, but I actually don't know where it comes from or why. My parents are South Indian, so they're from the state of Tamil Nadu, which is like right on the tip of like South India, and so I'm not really well versed in Tamil history or Tamil historiography in terms of their relationship with the nation state, but I do know that as soon as independence movement sort of like rises up and like starts to build up, and also during the 1940s, there is this huge like Tamil nationalist wing, and Tamil nationalist as like a good thing and sort of a bad thing in the sense of like real pride of like Tamil history or South Indian heritage, but also like real frustration with the center, right? By center, I don't mean political center, but like the metropole, like Delhi politics.
Okay.
And so I'm not sure if it really is rooted in like that Tamil Nadu maybe teaches its history differently, or that it teaches different, like it emphasizes different aspects, or it really emphasizes its local leaders more. But I think it's not weird that I got this story, mainly because it sort of ends up being the correct story, if I can be sort of biased. But like back to the original question, it is, I think, even for people who are South Indian, even for people who have never been to India, or South Asia in general, partition definitely plays a central role even today.
Well, I guess, yeah. What if there was, Yeah, if you wanted to be kind of up to snuff on the recent historiography on the partition, like who would you recommend reading?
Yeah.
I guess actually before you answer that, what I would be curious about is what narratives were they critiquing? So I know that might kind of sound backwards, but I'm sort of curious.
Yeah.
What was sort of an older school of thought, and then tell us sort of what is the more recent kind of school of
Yeah.
thought.
So basically, like the first narratives, right, is this idea that as soon as partition happens, the first few historians who are writing on this, maybe like in the 1970s, maybe 1980s, what they're basically saying is in Pakistan and in India, let's take India as an example, that Pakistan, we had to partition from Pakistan because nationalism and like religious fundamentalism, either in Pakistani ways and in Hinduism ways, was like a symptom caused by the British, and by us cutting off from Pakistan, we were really able to like reform as like a really good secular state, right? Like using all of those moralizing terms, right? And this idea that this idea that there's like this good nationalism versus bad nationalism versus good pride in your religious heritage versus like a bad one, right? But what's interesting is that during the 1980s, there's like a rapid rise of Hindu nationalism in India itself. And that leads to like a counteraction in the actual interpretations in the historiography, right? And so historians in the 1980s are grappling with new political realities that's happening in India, new interpretations, and there's a new interest in partition to sort of explain why is this communal violence still happening in India? Why are these, these anti-Sikh riots in 1984 after Indira Gandhi's assassinated, violence against Muslims, like why is that still happening, right? And they end up calling into question Nehru, his old vision, like his vision that partition was a pathology that development and nationalism can eventually like transcend. Like the good politics of the Indian state will eventually transcend the pathology that partition was, the problem that partition was.
So Nehru, did he support the partition?
Yeah, so eventually he does end up supporting partition, right? So the way to put it is that Jinnah, right? He is one of the major, he's the guy who's projecting this argument for like an independent Pakistan. And he's rooting it in this idea that Hinduism and Islam, this is the historical interpretation, the first historiography. They are basically arguing that, Jinnah saw Hinduism and Islam or Muslims as like embodying totally opposing ways of life. There's no way to build a secular, unified state where Hinduism and Islam exist in the way that it does, right? Think of like Huntington's like class of civilizations idea, right? Okay. And for Nehru, this is how historians are interpreting it initially, Nehru apparently sees the demand for partition as basically linked to this, like how modernity is eventually going to unfold itself, right? And for him, the driving forces of like modernity and modern transformation is science and secularism. And he thinks the only way to get to really focusing on secularism and science and rational politics and rational policy making is fine. We have to separate from Pakistan. That's just what we have to do, right? And India was deformed, specifically when it came to religion, by the structure of colonialism. This is how historians are interpreting it, right? That colonialism through the British Empire manipulated religion and distorted India's development, modern development, to serve its own purposes, exploitative purposes. Therefore, Nehru like acquiesces to partition because of this pragmatic calculation. And so you can see why that's a nationalist narrative for Indians, right? This idea that Nehru is this strong, secular, like pragmatic guy, and it really is Jinnah who's like driving this need for independent Pakistan. And for Pakistanis, the nationalist narrative really is this idea that Pakistan always had to happen. We had to be created this way because Hindus in India, in the independence movement, would never let us have equal representation in the state anyway. Therefore, Pakistan was foreordained, if you will, right? And so these are the two initial nationalist historiographies. But
a question about that Pakistani nationalist narrative.
Yeah.
It was there in that any kind of nostalgia for the empire, or like an implication that like Muslims had more of a voice thanks to British rule, that now that with independence was going to be snuffed out by the Hindu majority? Was that part of it, or is it not quite that?
I think what's interesting is I don't think that was, I'm not an expert, but I don't think that was mainly the part of it.
Okay.
During the independence movement, there is a lot of, at least like initial like unity in how you're actually going to fight the British, right? Maybe not how, but the idea that the British should leave. The Quit India movement should exist. It should happen. The empire should end. Because remember, we're talking about the 1940s, where other colonies had been able to eventually sort of get their independence, right? We're talking about the aftermath of World War II and the UN, and we're also talking about the aftermath of 1918 and the 14 points, right? So this idea that India, regardless of what its boundaries would be, should get its independence, I think can be fairly said it was a long time coming, right? And so it's not as if Jinnah or other major Muslim leaders are thinking, it was so much better during the British, let's just go back to that. I'm sure some maybe were, but I don't think that was like a realistic goal in the 1940s.
All right. So we have this sort of Pakistani nationalist historiography basically saying, the mean Hindus in India were never going to let us be equal. So, we had to separate. And then you have the Indian nationalist narrative where it's like, ideally it would have been great to have this, secular pan-Indian state, but it just wasn't going to be practical because of all the animosity that basically
the British had riled up. Yeah.
Okay. The British had riled up trying to split apart the Muslims and Hindus. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right.
And so these are these two nationalist narratives. In the sense, don't think of nationalism as like the modern connotation of nationalism as this horrible thing, but literally just like the national myths. These are the two national myths that we sort of built ourselves up to until the 1980s. And then, as I was saying, in the 1980s, there's huge acts of like communal violence in India. And so historians sort of like reinterrogate their interpretations of partition, right? And so they mainly reject like civilizational arguments, and they really begin to see the roots of partition, not just in the colonial era, like that continues, this idea that partition was rooted in problems created during the colonial era, but they reject this Nehruvian view that like nationalism and the negative developments could eventually distance itself from, like India could eventually distance itself from its colonial past through like good development and quote unquote good nationalism.
All right.
Right?
So it's not so much like apologetics for the empire, like saying that it wasn't the empire's fault. It's not so much about that as it is this kind of blind faith in the modern developmental state that was going to fix everything. That's what historians have become increasingly skeptical of.
Yeah. And so eventually in the 1980s, new historians are saying, no, nationalism itself is a product of these like this knowledge production during colonialism. It's deep-seated within colonialism. Therefore, if it's deep-seated within colonialism, it has a role to play in partition, right? It's not as if day one of Indian independence or day one in 1940, Indian nationalism is better than British imperialism in terms of this ideology. Right. And so they root it together and they tie it together. Right. And one methodological turn that takes is like an example you wanted in 2001. One of my most interesting books I read in the past few years is Gyanendra Pandey's book on partition, where basically he is trying to really excavate the violence accompanying partition on the ground, right? Specifically looking at how people on the ground in what is now India and Pakistan experienced it, right? And so this is no longer about this big nationalist myth making or even trying to make meaning of partition. It's more about what happened on the ground to the lives of people, and therefore you can recover the meaning that partition wasn't just like necessary, but also like it really forms the lives of like everyday communities from now on, right? And from until today, right?
Yeah. How do you see partition impacting, I guess what I'm curious about is, are there still kind of warring memories of partition within this, South Asian diaspora in the U.S. And I'm curious then how this newer historiography might, help the way you see that, understand that.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Right. And so like a historical example of this is like a book that was published. It wasn't published recently. It was published in the 1980s. It's Ayesha Jalal's book. And I would say it's the single most important book that somebody should go read if they want to go understand partition it's Ayesha Jalal's The Sole Spokesman. And it's basically about Jinnah, the Muslim League, and Pakistan. Right. And the argument she makes basically sparks immense frustration, not just in the Indian Academy, but also in the Indian public, as well as
immense. It was a big deal in the news, and
it was a big deal. I would say, like in that intellectual circle we were talking about in the beginning of this conversation, right? So it's published in 1985, and like a way to distill her argument down into a couple sentences is that Jinnah was a really bad poker player. Right. So this idea that Jinnah, when he is negotiating on behalf of Muslims and is trying to get a better deal for Muslims in terms of districts and voting, and not just voting, but also like number of let's say MPs is a way to put it. Right. But basically like a better deal for Muslims within a single state of India. When those negotiations are happening in the 1930s and 1940s, Jinnah basically used Pakistan as like the bottom line, as like a threat, as like a giant bluff, right? And it seems like what Jalal argues is that in the early days of these negotiations, that he was basically trying to extract the best possible deal from the British for the Muslim League, the best possible deal from the British and what is now India for the Muslim League and Indian Muslims in general. And he would have settled for basically a federal solution where Muslims had a little bit more representation than what they were getting, right? And so
it's almost kind of like the Wallonia Flanders relationship in Belgium. That's kind of what he was aiming for.
Yeah, sort of, right? And so the reason this argument, Jalal's argument, pisses off not just India, like Indian intellectuals in the Indian Academy, but also Pakistani intellectuals, is because it's basically saying Pakistan was an accident, yo. Right? And saying that is incredibly damaging to, let's just say, like, let's put it in like the most dramatic way possible. That's damaging to a country's psyche, right? Like this idea that your national myth that you have been building in order to keep stability in your country is totally gone, right? And the same thing for India. The national myth you've been making that Nehru, as well as all the players in this, made the most pragmatic choice, but also this national myth that like not only are we a secular nation and like we made this choice like willingly and intelligently, knowing of all the consequences, but now we can no longer say that we are like quote unquote Hindustan, which is literally what we are, without really evoking the pain of partition, right? It basically reopens this wound for Indian nationalists, right? That if the Indian nationalist narrative is not correct, it frustrates this idea of we were rooted in secularism from day one, and it was Pakistan that made the problem, right? And that's dangerous again for India's psyche as well, if you want to put it that way, right? And so this argument, Jalal's book in 1985, is, I would say, again, one of the most important books you could read, but on like this strain of looking at the everyday politics and everyday frustrations. What happens with Jalal's book, what she's able to do in the partition historiography, is basically get a lot of people to stop asking the same exact question over and over and over again, which is what caused partition? Because that is an important question. It is an interesting question. And obviously it plays a huge role in how Indians and Pakistanis and Bangladeshis understand their politics, their state, their communities. But that's not the only historical question you can be asking. And that's not the only way you can help understand how we are where we are today, where you have Muslims being attacked in India still to this day, right? Or where you have intellectuals being attacked by the BJP. Right? So, and then two really good examples that are more recent is The Great Partition and The Long Partition. So these are two separate books. The first one, The Great Partition, it's Yasmin Khan. She published it in 2008. And The Long Partition is Zamindar. It's Vazira Zamindar. And basically, like, I can summarize these books really quickly by pointing out that, like, they do really play by the same narratives we've sort of heard since the 1980s, that the British played off one group against the other before suddenly abandoning them, which is basically what happened. Indian negotiations or negotiations within like the Indian state are having issues, specifically when it has this like Muslim Hindu question. But where they differ with previous studies is they really go on the day-to-day and try to understand how these two new states deal with partition. And so one example of that is looking at how like property, right? How property values, not just property values, but like who owns property is dealt by these new emerging bureaucracies, and how India and Pakistan basically build their states around managing partition and managing its new citizens. And these two recent histories make clear that like not only is like the nationalist view is false, but that partition is central to understanding how India and Pakistan even exist as states, right? Because we basically rooted our national myth is rooted in that. Like, so that you have people, and this is really important. So like there are people out there who do celebrate August 15th as Independence Day, right? And then there are a lot of people who are from Punjab or West India who don't, because independence brought immense violence and bloodshed to their families.
Because independence was simultaneous with partition?
Yeah, independence is simultaneous with partition.
Okay.
Literally, the day Nehru gives his speech and everyone finds out they're independent, like that's like, I think a couple of hours later, you realize partition is happening. I used to work with the 1947 Partition Archive, which is right here in Berkeley, where they do oral histories of people who survived partition. And I actually got to interview one person about this. And he was like 5 years old in Delhi. And basically, he described how like he was living in an apartment building in Delhi with his family. And in this apartment building, there's like a Sikh family, a Persian family, a British family, a Muslim family. And for all five of these families in this apartment building and also in his community, partition came as a shock. It's not as if it was like really, really talked about, right? And so
sounds pretty traumatic. Golly.
It is really traumatic. Like think of like how it would feel like if we were in the, let's say like 1800s in America, and we had like families who had fought in the Revolutionary War, or let's say we were like loyalists in 18th century America. We supported the British Empire, and then we decided to stay in America after independence. Like it's based like that's like a really simplistic analogy, but it's basically like living like that, right? Regardless of where you are. And there's like families that are separated, people who like lose their houses who can like never go back, right? So like Muslims who have to go from India to Pakistan, Hindus have to go from Pakistan to India, and vice versa. And so there is not just bloodshed, but so much like property loss and unavoidable like trauma in the process of independence, in the process of partition, that of course it plays central to how we think about politics today.
Yeah.
Right?
What are some specific things, like it seems like is the biggest knock against Modi what he tolerated in 2002, or what specifically has he done past 5 years that Indian and Indian American liberals would criticize?
Yeah, so I mean,
I just sort of hear the vague, he's like Trump or whatever, but as far as what is actually going on that's controversial.
So like one example rooted in his campaign was that he would bring economic prosperity to India, right? Like really grow India's economic growth, bring more jobs, really lift the poor out of poverty, lift the middle class even higher. And that has not been the case. economic growth has slowed. He has not been able to provide the jobs that he said he would. Unemployment is pretty high, especially compared to what he projected and what he hoped for and what he promised. But also the government, the BJP government, is lying about these numbers as well. So we don't actually know how bad it is really, right? That's one example. Another example, really concrete policy example, is, I would say, one of his biggest failures is demonetization, right? So demonetization is rolled out, I think in like 2016, and it basically sucks as a policy. It does not do what it achieved. Demonetization basically pulled a bunch of notes out of the currency system, and it was supposed to basically correct like corrupt cash transactions and corrupt people in India, but that's not what it did, and it created massive frustrations among rural people who don't have access to banks in the same way, and one day their money is basically worth nothing, and it's hard to transfer into money that is worth something, right? And so that's just one small example. But on the more like side that I would say, like, a lot of Indian American liberals, but also just Americans may have heard already, maybe if they watched Hassan Minhaj, like he did a recent special on this on Netflix, or if they watched, I think this was during Modi's election, John Oliver, one of his first shows on Last Week Tonight was on the Indian election. But what they will know is that Modi's rhetoric is incredibly similar to a lot of other nationalists that we've been hearing about since then, right? Modi's rhetoric is incredibly similar to nationalist rhetoric of not just Donald Trump, but also, I would say, Duterte, similar to Bolsonaro, similar to the nationalist language of Marine Le Pen, and the Brexiters in the UK. But this has ripple effects in the actual community that we don't pay attention to. And so, like, a recent example is cow lynchings. Have you heard of these? Cow
lynchings?
Yeah, that's what they're called. I think it's a really frustrating thing to call it that. I don't really know how to explain that. So basically, for Indian Hindus, cows are sacred in Hinduism, right? I am a member of a certain caste in Hinduism where I don't eat beef, I don't eat any meat, but for most Hindus, they don't eat beef. And in general, cows are deeply revered, right? And so a recent story, this was sometime in 2018 that I read, his name is Qasim Qureshi. Basically, there's a mob, at least 25 attackers. They kick him and beat him with sticks. Why? Because he's a livestock trader. And he was accused by his killers of slaughtering cows. But it is legal in where he was doing it. And there are mobs of these so-called cow protectors a lot in India. They exist like in a bunch of different areas in Indian states, right? And
I'm guessing the man who was attacked was Muslim? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And even if he wasn't Muslim, he was a livestock trader, right? But it is this type of violence is stoked by the fact that we have emboldened a member of the BJP party, but specifically a member of the BJP party that has direct ties to the RSS and is still proud of those ties.
Was he in the RSS when he was younger?
He was. Okay. He was in the RSS, and he's still proud of it, and he still talks about it, right? And this is happening like all across India. And there is a great New Yorker piece on it, actually. I think this was just this month in 2019. Eliza Griswold talked, the title of the article is The Violent Toll of Hindu Nationalism in India. Okay. And she talks about another person, Irshad Khan, who is attacked. And it's deeply frustrating to see how something that you've been raised with, I would say this as an Indian American liberal or even an Indian American in general, it's deeply frustrating to see one thing you've been brought up with your whole life, that we don't eat beef and cows are sacred and this is blah, 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 why? And then you wake up one day in early 2018 and you realize, oh, not only is like beef sort of banned in one state, but there are people going around using the religion you've been brought up with to murder people, right? And that's like deeply frustrating to some people. Yeah. But there are also, as we talked about with my ill-fated dating life, there are also people who like refuse to believe these reports that like Muslims are being targeted, or even other minority groups are being targeted, such as lower caste Hindus, right? And so I think that's what's like really frustrating about Modi, is not only has he not delivered on these economic promises that people of all different castes and religions sort of believed he would, but he really is stoking this type of not just Hindu national, because it's not a way, like it's not an easy, there's not an easy definition to put that, but like it's like really like he's stoking this type of rhetoric that is a dog whistle to Indians, right? It doesn't seem like a dog whistle to people in the United States, but it is a dog whistle to Hindu Americans.
I guess, do you talk to people who are Indian American or perhaps NRIs who say, oh yeah, like they believe that those things happen, but they're like, you know, there's no like direct, you know, it's not like Modi told the people to do it. I mean,
that literally happened this past Saturday. So this past Saturday, I go to a coffee shop, right? And I'm on this date. It's the first date, and I haven't really talked to this person a lot. I sort of talked to him like what he did for his job before I agreed to go on this date. And I actually I don't feel bad talking about this on like the internet, because like, the person, he was deeply frustrating because I didn't bring up Modi or Indian politics at all. Mm-hmm. I basically start by talking about like comedians that I liked, and I mentioned Hassan Minhaj, and he goes off on the Indian election special.
Is Minhaj Pakistani American?
He's Indian. He's an Indian Muslim.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he's an Indian Muslim, right? And so he goes off on this special by basically saying, these are his words, not mine. Internet, do not take this out of context. He says, I don't believe this false narrative that Muslims are being mistreated in India. And I was like, as a historian, that pained me, because Muslims have been mistreated not just in India, but in the Western world for the past couple of decades, right? It's that Islamophobia is a real thing. It is a real, like, growing disease in a lot of countries. And you don't have to only read one media source in India to believe that. It exists and it does happen, and it's daily, but it's also violent, and it's also it happens everywhere, right? And the point that I was trying to make with him is that this rhetoric that Modi puts out is important and dangerous, and there are people, specifically this person that I met, who like refuse to believe that. This like refuse to believe that there was a direct link with that, and I'm just like, that doesn't make sense, because words have meaning, right? And so like an example we didn't talk about of like why the RSS is dangerous and why like there are Muslims being mistreated and like how nationalism is on the rise is in the 1990s. So this is one of the most famous events that have happened, and is really important if you're trying to understand the history of Hindu nationalism. The BJP and the RSS is in 1992. The Babri Masjid in Ayodhya, India, is destroyed. This giant group from the RSS basically move and like destroy and demolish this mosque in Ayodhya, India, and they believe that that you should put a temple here, because Ayodhya is where Rama is born, right? From a Hindu myth, right? And this leads to massive communal violence, and so this idea that there isn't mistreatment of Muslims in India is deeply problematic to me, not just as like an Indian American or as an American who is seeing Islamophobia in her own recently naturalized country where I'm now an American citizen, but it's also deeply frustrating that the country where like the way that your parents or the way that Muslims you've grown up with, Muslim friends have taught the relationship between religion doesn't play out in its politics. And so like that's a real like, again, I'm speaking anecdotally, but that's a real like moment of like frustration, I would say, for a lot of people, as like, or like a real coming of age aspect, I would say, right? Like so like when like another like bad example or bad comparison would be like the day that like maybe a religious teenager or like a Christian evangelical in the United States realizes, maybe it's sort of weird that my parents are a little bit homophobic, right? Like that must be like a real crisis of consciousness, or sorry, crisis of conscience for like a teenager, right? And I think it's the same thing for like young Indian Americans today, is that because we're not connected to the daily barrage of news in India, because we live in the United States, it's easier for us, and this is like maybe also a bad thing, but it's easier for us to simplify and judge the really complex history of communal strife and violence in India, and also distill that into like a single like image of hatred. And like the reason I'm talking about this is because I think that's what he got from me. Like he met me, right? This person I'm on a date with, he met me. He hears me talk for a few minutes about this because he brought it up, and then I think he's decided immediately, oh, this is a person who doesn't read any Indian news, and even if she does read Indian news, she doesn't really know anything. And because she's a liberal, she's so detached from India and her culture that like she's judging her own homeland, right? And I think that's true for a lot of immigrants, regardless of where you're from, is that like when you come back to your home country, or if you speak to people from your home country, there's like a culture shock, and the way you respond to that culture shock is pointing out how you disagree with that. And that disagreement can come off as what is it? Not prejudice, but like better than, right? That you're being condescending. And I like, so it really is important for me personally. This is like just a personal thing. It's important for me personally to like really immerse myself in the news as much as I can, and in the history and in the books that people are writing about India right now, to make sure that I'm not engaging in like a simplistic like frustration with Indian politics, because that's all fun and good, but
well, I know you got to go soon. I guess
oh right,
yeah, the
I don't realize it until like it's over. Yeah.
If you have like 5 minutes, I was gonna ask it, what sort of sites, magazines, or whatever like you follow as far as to English language, so that anyone listening or watching this is wants to educate themselves as well as what's going on in current Indian politics. What would be some recommendations?
Yeah, so I think like the best one right now, like that's more online focused, is scroll.in. So it's basically scroll.in. You can also read like the Indian Express. You could also read the Hindu, I guess. You could also torture yourself and watch NDTV, which is basically Indian CNN, but even more intense. But I think beginning with scroll.in would be really good. And then sort of like looking at who's writing and like what they're writing about, sort of is a good way to go about that. But I like scroll.in as like a really first stop. And then I maybe if I have the time, and sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, I look at other sources like the Indian Express, like the Hindu Times. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. So and in that case, I think we can wrap up. People can follow you on Twitter. You're at Varsha _Venkat_, right?
Yep.
So VARSHA _VENKAT _. You can follow me at William R. Black. And thank you for talking to us and giving us some everything that we've mentioned as far as reading recommendations. We'll have links to on YouTube and on the Blogging Heads site if you want to follow that up.
Definitely. And if people have more questions, or if people have corrections, DM me or talk to me on Twitter. I'd love to.
Oh, and people should check out the podcast that you co-host. I forgot to mention at the start, Hellbent, which is a hoot.
Yeah, it's a politics podcast, and so it's just mainly about American politics. But if you are an American and you want to hear two women talking about American politics, go for it.
It's you and who's your co-host?
My co-host is Devin Handy. She is in LA. Yeah.
Gotcha. Very good.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and you have a good day.
Thanks so much. You too.